evening. I'm Jackie Yong, Senior Curator for Fashion and Textiles at ACM and Peranakan Museum, and also Exhibition Curator for the current Androgen exhibition at the museum. So tonight, a warm welcome to everyone for this talk, Androgen, a Parisian designer with an American sensibility. This talk is the last in a series of talks organized in conjunction with the special exhibition Androgen, Fashioning Singapore and the World happening right now and closing on Sunday. Our speaker tonight, here with me, of course, is Petra Slinkard, Director of Curatorial Affairs and the Nancy Putnam Curator of Fashion and Textiles at the Peabody Essex Museum in Boston. At PAM, she oversees the museum's newly opened fashion and design gallery and served as the co-curator of Made It, the Women Who Revolutionized Fashion, organized in association with the Kunstmuseum in The Hague. She recently coordinated the exhibition Patrick Kelly, Runway of Love, at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I'm so glad that we have her with us in person tonight. I have great respect for her curatorial work, and we share a deep appreciation of Androgen's life and creations. In fact, Petra is actually the first curator to acquire Andrew's works for a museum. She will share more about that later before ACM. And when researching on Androgen for this exhibition, it was clear to me that there were so many narratives possible. I decided to focus the exhibition on Androgen in the context of Asia and Europe. And I invited Petra, therefore, to contribute much more analysis from an American perspective for the catalog. She will share more tonight, but do get the catalog to get the full picture. So here's a quick share, I thought, to share a bit of the exhibition with you before I head over to Petra, so you can see how her talk complements the exhibition. And just in case you have not been to see the exhibition, this is just a quick overview. Of course, we start with Andrew himself. For Andrew, of course, he established his label in Paris in 1995, and since then till now, he is the first and only Singaporean label to consistently show during Paris Fashion Week. And actually in 2007, he was already awarded the President Design Award for Fashion. So he's no overnight sensation, and in this exhibition, we talk about how, of course, he is definitely one of Singapore's most prolific designers, and he's constantly mentioned in media reports as well as research articles as being one of our most successful fashion exports. And the exhibition itself, this is a photograph of the catalog. I hear that it's sold out for the day, but tomorrow they might have more copies if you'd like to get one. So just a bit about the exhibition. The exhibition here presents the fashion journey of Andrew. We celebrate his donation of 160 works, in which 114 are on display. And through this exhibition, we look at how his works bridge dichotomies of East and West, tradition and modernity, the local and the global, and of course, how it reflects Singapore history as a port city that celebrates diversity. So just a quick bit on the 5 sections that are more focused on Asia and Europe. So one of the first sections you see is how Andrew imagined Asia in his works. Particularly, of course, we start with his roots in Singapore and Southeast Asia. That's the platform that you're looking at in the picture. He spent half his life here before, in 1986, he went to study fashion at Central St. Martin's in London. Petra will share more on that to come. There's another section in this exhibition about how he imagined China and Japan in his works. He is a very avid collector of Chinese art, particularly Chinese porcelain, and visited Japan many times since he was young in the 60s to 80s. And particularly for Turkey, ceramics was a point of entry for him. And another section of this exhibition is about how Andrew's works imagine the West, particularly through 3 time periods, which is 17th to 18th century Baroque art and Rococo fashion. So very strongly French. I was looking much more at the French influence in his works and ideas. And another section in this part was about late 19th to early 20th century art movements that influenced him, such as Impressionism. And again, many of the art movements that I highlighted in the exhibition are from Europe. Although he really loved American art, so I think Petra will talk more about that as well. And finally, the third part of this section was about the 1960s to 70s street styles in London that influenced him. Another part of the exhibition is about corals and butterflies, which are the two house coats of his for Andrew. So house coats are particularly distinctive visual motifs that happen again and again in his works. And for Andrew, butterflies draw particularly from his love for the Chinese classic, The Butterfly Lovers, which is a Chinese tale for love and hope. So where possible at ACM, I always try to highlight the Asian inspirations for the designers. And finally, there is this section about Andrew and how his works are made. All of his works, the work itself, the embellishments, the trimmings, they are all created at 74 Rue du Tom in Paris. They are all created, designed there before it's manufactured in France, Italy, and India. So again, this section is much more on Europe and Asia. And this section, which is actually possibly the first section that you see, is the part of the show that have a bit of the U.S. So this section is about leading women around the world who wear Andrew's works. So for me, I thought it was quite a good way to start people who to get a sense that if you have not heard of Andrew, for example, as he's a smaller independent label, you might have already actually seen his works worn by actual women. Leading celebrities or as well as royal women around the world. So this section explores that idea, and we have 3 platforms that take you from Asia to Europe, and finally one section on Hollywood. But that's just that little bit that you get to hear about Andrew in the US. So now I'll pass over to Petra, who will share a lot more about Andrew's influence and impact in the US. Over to you, Petra. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Yes? Okay, I'm going to scoot forward because I have notes and I forgot my glasses, so bear with me. Well, first off, it's so nice to see you all this evening. Jackie, I'm going to ask you to tap me if we get to about 10 minutes or so till, because I want to make sure that we leave room for questions. But I'm so pleased to be here. How many of you have seen the exhibition? Oh, most. Excellent. Okay, well, if you have not, please do so. It closes on Saturday, and it's an exquisite... Sunday. I'm giving false information already. It is an exquisite survey, I think, of Andrew's work and his impact as a designer, but also all of the references and points of inspiration that he draws together in his work. And so, as I said, it's a pleasure to be here. This is my first visit to ACM and also to Singapore. So I was excited to be here for a number of reasons. And I'd like to thank ACM for inviting me, and also in particular, Andrew, for inviting me to participate in this project. Andrew's work is, interesting because, I've known Andrew for a number of years, and we first met in Chicago, where I held a position of curator of costume at the Chicago History Museum prior to my post in Massachusetts, where I currently reside and work. And in my conversations with Andrew, I've always been struck by his interest in American fashion history. In particular, he's quite taken with the work of Geoffrey Beene and the work of Pauline Trégère, who are favorites of his. And he has always regarded American art and fashion as forward-thinking and modern. And even though he has his atelier based in Paris, when I asked him about his origin story, how he came to be a designer and sort of what he responds to and how he considers himself, he said, he really thinks of himself more as an American or Anglo-Saxon designer than a French one. And while he holds American style and sensibility in high esteem, he is certainly, as you probably have seen in the exhibition, a more is more kind of personality. But he is still perennially inspired by classic, easy-to-wear shapes and silhouettes. And while he hates sort of fussy and he has a more of a maximalist point of view, he does feel that it is different than that of his Parisian colleagues. And the clothing created by the House of Andrew is best known for its opulence, its beauty, its embellishment. But what I have found to be most interesting is that his use of silhouette is more akin to his American predecessors. There's a cleanliness, there's a streamlinedness to the clothing that he creates. I was thrilled as a friend and as a colleague of Andrew's to have the opportunity to see his likeness in both the catalog and the exhibition as a child with his family. And so the photo on the left is Andrew with his parents, and the photo on the right is of his grandmother. And it's important to see Andrew as a young person because I think his lived experiences have very much informed the way that he designs and the way that he thinks about design. And he's not unlike many designers in that realm, but his family, his parents, really instilled in him an appreciation for all things beautiful. One of the ways that Andrew was introduced to American fashion was through American publications like Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. As a child in the 1970s, this is where he absorbed his information about high fashion, about, in a sense, sort of international fashion. And at that time, in these periodicals, there was a lot of focus, almost kind of a hyper-focus, on the importance of marrying efficiency in style. There was this undercurrent and this repetitive narrative that women in particular needed to understand how to go from day to night, and that there was a way to sort of streamline your wardrobe, and that it was very important to be appropriate to a setting. Now, and of course, in our 21st century lifestyle, that I don't think holds as much water as it maybe once did. But what I think it did was it enabled Andrew to start thinking about pace and start thinking about lifestyle from a different point of view, where it was necessary to understand that people, but women in particular, were on the go. They were not relegated to a household. And so while these publications provided tips for chic and busy women, this idea of sort of maintaining a sense of allure and grace while still functioning is one of the underlying themes to the ethos of the House of Andrew Ginn. New York, for Andrew, was a very formative experience. As Jackie mentioned, he was educated in London at Central St. Martin's, and he had the opportunity to visit New York as a young man in the early 90s as a student as part of an exchange program with Parsons School of Design. And what Andrew learned from being in kind of the hustle and the bustle of the city is that what he saw in those American magazines really only blew up in the environment in which he was living. And that there was this desire to be glamorous, but there was also this desire to be on the go and to have functionality really infused in the clothing. The slide that you see currently, to me, is sort of speaks perfectly to Andrew. It is an example of the 1990s club scene in New York, and then also an example of Martha, the boutique that is a storied boutique from both Palm Beach and New York that sold only the top-of-the-line clothing. And so what you see is this dichotomous relationship between the energy of downtown New York and the energy of sort of uptown New York. And Andrew was exposed to both. And he really says to him, when he reflects on this moment in time, that he loved being there because Martha's was there, Barney's was downtown. He would love to go clubbing, and that he loved sort of soaking in all of this energy. And I think it sort of speaks again to the dichotomous nature of Andrew, because if you know Andrew, if you've seen any photos of Andrew, Andrew himself presents himself usually in jeans and a t-shirt, maybe a turtleneck. Like there's a very sort of a humble approach to his own aesthetic, because he puts all of his energy into designing for his clients. I mentioned Parsons, and Parsons really comes into Andrew's life at a pivotal moment. Parsons School of Design in the 1970s moves locations downtown to the Village, and he attends at this time when Parsons also starts to adopt a new philosophy around design thinking, and I think that really in sort of inspired and influenced his way of employing design as a way to solve complex problems, which we'll get to in a little bit. And then Andrew goes back to Paris. He works for Monsieur Ongaro. He starts his business in 1995, and in 1999 and early 2000s, he returns to New York. He is a freshly minted, emerging designer who's trying to find his footing in the global network. And he's welcomed by boutiques in New York as an emerging designer, and one of which that you see here on the screen is Karina Zabete, which is a cutting-edge concept store offering high-end designer women's fashions at a premium price point. And he took that aesthetic of the American woman, studying these lifestyles, and created a brand that both promoted beauty and empowerment. And you can see this nice quote from Town and Country magazine that I think sort of summarizes the ethos of that particular boutique, which is still around and just moved uptown to Madison Avenue. So, Andrew is really an enigma in the contemporary fashion world. He is forward-thinking, but he also represents kind of this old school, more traditional approach to his client relationships. He designs with clients in mind. And one of the things that, for me personally, that really I think is impressive about the House of Andrew Ginn is that in a sea of conglomerates, he has been able to maintain independence. He has not been gobbled up by a larger house or a larger corporation. He's been able to maintain independence, living and working in Paris for over 30 years. And while I'm not sure that it's really fair to say that there's sort of a stereotypical American approach to business, but I think that it would be fair to say that stereotypically entrepreneurship and sort of go-get-emness and this notion of evolution is something that is akin to the way that historically American businesses have been able to set themselves apart. And I think that those are values that Andrew adopted in his business practice. One of the other things that Andrew developed is a close relationship to those clients. So I mentioned kind of that old school approach, that notion of getting to know people and investing in them. They are not just dollar signs, they are individuals. And this is a quote by Andrew that I think is very important. And one of the things that he has done quite effectively is to create a network in the United States. I think in the catalog I use the phrase that he developed a cult following. So his followers, for lack of a better word, are loyal, they are passionate, and they will seek him out. So if he comes to San Francisco, if he comes to Chicago, and they live in a nearby area, they will drive, they will take the train, they will seek him out because they know that A, he's a delight to be around, but also that they're excited and they anticipate the collections that he brings. The flip side of that is that Andrew has an excellent memory. I don't know how he does it, but he's able to create that connection with you and establish an imprint where he says, okay, I know that when I see Mrs. Johnson next time, I'm going to bring these 4 or 5 things with me because those things will suit her. They will suit her lifestyle. They will suit her figure. They will suit the kind of aesthetic that I think embodies who she is. And one of the ways that Andrew was introduced to a clientele in Chicago was through work that we did together at the Chicago History Museum. He was invited by a philanthropic group associated with the museum called the the History Museum's Costume Council that is now in its almost 50th year, and that organization really supports the efforts of that museum. And one of the ways that they support the efforts of that museum is they invite established and emerging designers to Chicago and plan events around them. So one part charity, absolutely, it is a fundraising function, but it is also an opportunity for the stores, and in particular in Chicago, if you've never been, Michigan Avenue is a centrally concentrated area for high-end retail. And so in this case, the Chicago History Museum worked very closely with an outlet, Neiman Marcus. They invited Andrew to come, and it was a 3-day affair. Andrew and the Chicago History Museum team toured our collection, and then the following day, he was hosted to a 200-person luncheon where he engaged in a fashion show and a conversation with the individual that you see here, a woman named Nina Ivan. Nina Ivan was the president of the Costume Council at that time. She is also a 50-plus year veteran of Saks Fifth Avenue. She started working at Saks Fifth Avenue on Michigan Avenue when she was 15 years old. Unfortunately, her family had some challenges that occurred, and she ended up continuing to work as a young person and establishing one of the most, I think, admired and respected retail careers in the United States, and went on to become the fashion director for Saks Fifth Avenue for a number of years. She is a consummate professional. And so to see she and Andrew on stage together and engage in conversation that speaks to the contemporary but also the historic was a really wonderful feat. Here are a few images from that particular fashion show. The house was delighted, and I think, one of the things that I really admire about ACM is taking in, the opportunity to share Andrew's story and his clothes with a community and a population, and in this case on a global scale, with people who might not know who he is. Because while individuals who attended this luncheon, I would say 10% may have known who Andrew was, all of them left with a deeper appreciation for who he is. And then when Neiman Marcus held their trunk show the next day, they all showed up and all became sort of steadfast clients from that point forward. Fast forwarding a year ahead, he returned to Chicago, and as I said, he sort of kept those individuals in mind, and he brought specific pieces to sell to them the following year. And here are just a few more individuals from that, so kind of real time. And then I was delighted to see this piece in the exhibition. The individual on the far right-hand side is a member of Chicago History Museum's Costume Council, and you can see that she's wearing the piece that's featured in the show. And so I did take the opportunity to walk through the exhibition with Jackie yesterday and try to incorporate some images that I took with my cell phone, so you do have to forgive me if the quality is not good. But I love being able to see the pieces presented as Andrew would see them, so sort of runway style, and then how they might be worn by real people in real life. One of the other attributes that Andrew adopted for his business that I think is really important to call out is, and also kind of speaking to that old school tradition, are trunk shows. So the individual that you see on the screen is another American fashion designer named Bill Blass. Bill Blass was a pro at the trunk show. He would pack up his car, travel cross country. He knew all of the ladies, which he were really referred to as his ladies. He would dine with them. He would go to the opera with them. He engaged these women as friends, as confidants, as individuals that he grew to respect, and the feeling was very mutual. And so you can see sort of Bill in two different environments, one in the trunk show environment and the other where he is, sort of captivating the women here. And, it's interesting to think that while this practice has waned in the 21st century, because some contemporary designers feel that it is sort of outdated and old-fashioned, who better to sell the clothing that you have created than the individual who created it? The heart is there, the intention is there, the inspiration is there, and you can talk about the clothes in a way that I think a buyer may not have the same opportunities to do when they just receive a style sheet. So it's almost like a tutorial where the designer is going in and meeting with the buyers and learning about the collections. And so Andrew adopted this technique and this philosophy in his own practice. And you can see that he has done trunk shows with outlets like Bergdorf Goodman in New York, but he's gone everywhere from Toronto to San Francisco to Dallas to Houston and continued this practice. one of the things, as Jackie mentioned, is that Andrew's work is everywhere. You just don't always know that you're looking at it. And I think that there's this quiet, subtle sophistication to his work that appeals to a great number of individuals. And the range is extraordinary. His work is worn by US ambassadors, by socialites, by Hollywood stars, by musicians. And there's this sort of interesting mix in the way in which individuals have adopted his aesthetic. And when you see it on individuals, you may not necessarily connect that this is an Andrew Ginn piece, that you might not say initially, oh, because what you see is the individual. And that, I think, as a fashion designer, is one of the most important procedures, for lack of a better word, to adopt as you are designing for an individual. Because it shouldn't be about the brand first and the individual second. It should be about the individual first, and then, oh my gosh, darling, you look so wonderful, who are you wearing? And then it reinforces the notion that this designer gets the person and gets the environment that the individual is wearing the dress in. So I labeled Andrew as the unexpected futurist because, as I said, there was this dichotomous nature to his work. He's adopted these more traditional kind of old school practices, but he's also fully embraced social media and e-commerce. And one of the things that I think has made his embrace of e-commerce so successful is that he took that time to build this trust with these clients. He built those relationships with these clients. So even though he wasn't necessarily returning to San Francisco on an annual basis because of COVID, because of life circumstances, there are a number of reasons why travel has stopped. But people remained loyal to him and to the brand. And so he took the advice of his colleague, Ruth Chapman, who said, online is kind of where it's at. And in particular, he embraced Instagram. Now, I will say that when we published the book, at that time, he had 180,000 followers. I looked today, and he has 211,000 followers. So that shows you just how much growth there has taken place in a short period of time. But what Andrew, I think, is ready to admit, or readily admits, is that he may not have the millions that the other Parisian houses might have, but he knows that each one of these followers is a real person. These are individuals that he engages with. And what Ruth Chapman described to him is something called screen appeal. She said, you have literally 5 seconds to capture someone's attention on the screen. So you better make those 5 seconds count. And the House of Andrew Ginn has taken that idea so seriously that when they prepare their models, when they prepare their photographs to be posted on Instagram or on e-commerce sites, they actually show the model standing afar from a mirror that is against the room by 5 meters. So they can tell that from that distance, at that scale, that everything is still perfect. And when we talk about trust and this notion of building those relationships, when you order a work from the House of Andrew Ginn, you can be positive that it will arrive the way that you remember it. You can be positive that the work is of a quality that is worth the investment. I have certainly myself purchased things online via Instagram and other sort of traps, and it's arrived and I thought, oh my gosh, why did you fall into that? Because it was not good quality. It did not look the way that it looked on the screen. And so I really appreciate and respect the fact that Andrew and his team take that time to do it right. Another thing that Andrew embraced, which I think is really kind of tongue-in-cheek and also sort of speaks to his playful side, is the adoption of hashtags. Now, I know that hashtags' popularities have ebbed and flowed, but he sort of took himself as and his name as an opportunity to think about what the world needed in that moment. And I think coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, coming out of a period of isolation, coming out of a period of upheaval, he decided to bring some levity to the situation. And the first hashtag that he produced was I Feel Again, AGN, sort of taking that tongue-in-cheek play on his last name. And then from there, he went to I feel hungry again, I feel inspired again, I feel excited again. And you can see here, this is his typical style. So again, very casual, very approachable. And I keep trying to convince him to sell these t-shirts, but I'm not sure that he is convinced that he will do that as of yet. But it was this means of delivering a personal message of hope and of uplift. And it was really well received by his audience. And, I think that the model has proven so successful that his team actually abandoned the idea of setting up brick and mortar stores in U.S. markets, such as San Francisco and New York, because he had done that groundwork early on, and now people have already and continue to engage with him through e-commerce. And so he's taken the approach of really embracing e-commerce and redirecting those resources to that particular outlet versus the brick and mortar. And this is just a screen share from the Matches Fashion site, which is run by Ruth Chapman. If you haven't been to his YouTube channel, I would encourage you to do so. Many of the shows that he's not either producing on the runway are produced for YouTube, or he's doing a second round of presentation, again, that can be seen globally. And I think that this also speaks to another important aspect of Andrew's practice and his ethos, and that is of access and inclusivity. His price points are high because the quality of his clothing warrants that. But I think that as far as understanding that only a certain number of people can get into a fashion show, only a certain number of people can get into a fundraiser or a high society engagement, utilizing platforms such as this one really enables him to connect with a much larger audience than he would have otherwise. How am I doing on time? Am I okay? Okay, so as Jackie mentioned, another aspect of Andrew that I think is really important is that he is a collector of art. He is a consummate student of art history. He collects textiles, art, porcelain, and experiences. One of my favorite parts about Andrew is that he loves to travel, he loves to eat, he loves to sort of embrace all that life has to offer. And I think that enthusiasm for life, but also his understanding and his appreciation for hue, for light, for saturation and texture, has enabled him to sort of hone this unique ability to combine colors and patterns in really beautiful and striking ways. He does have a great appreciation for abstract expressionist movement, particularly in the United States. The work of Joan Mitchell and Milton Avery stand out, two of whom are modern American painters who really excel at the use of color. And I think it has, encouraged Andrew to take color and really sort of explode it. And he has become a master colorist in his own right, and his palettes are truly flawless. And what I appreciate about that is that he combines colors that a lot of people, I think, would be afraid to put together. And there's also this tendency that his clothes, in my opinion, are sensual. They're not vulgar. They're feminine, they're not dowdy, and they're electric, but they're not overdone. But it's because of this interest in art, architecture, popular culture, and social history that I think really enables him to kind of create that delicate balance and walk that line. I'm going to switch gears here now for a moment, because one of the other things that I think really resonates for me as a student of American fashion and as an individual who's had the opportunity to speak with Andrew personally about his respect for American fashion is that he is focused on, as a sort of a streamlined kind of modern approach to design, but he I think is referencing two major American fashion designers in his work without maybe even knowing it. The first is a gentleman on the left-hand side whose name is Maine Rousseau Bacher. He was the first American to establish a Parisian couture house in 1930. And the house was known as Mambochet. Now, Maine Bacher went on to design for Wallace S. Simpson. He went on to design uniforms for the Girl Scouts. He went on to establish a couture house in the United States, which is almost unheard of. And the other individual is Roy Frowick Halston, who's better known by the single name Halston. And Halston, unfortunately, passed away the year that Andrew moved to New York to do his exchange program. But there is definitely, in my opinion, a similarity to their approach to design. I share with you this quote from Christian Dior in regard to Mambochet, because as Dior says, Mambochet is really in advance of all of us because he does it in the United States, meaning that to be a couturier, to be a custom designer in Paris is hard. It is a difficult market to break into, and if you know fashion history, you know the Parisians are very, very protective of their industry. Not everybody gets in, not everybody gets to qualify, and not everyone has the same opportunities. But to take that practice and to take the notion of being a couturier and then try to apply it in the United States, where, as I said, that was pretty much unheard of, and ready-to-wear was the only thing that Americans had really embraced through high-end retail, it was an anomaly, and it really did make this designer stand apart. The other thing that I think makes Andrew and Mambochet sort of akin to one another is Mambochet, or Maine Bacher, was not shy about his idea of perfection. He was so detail-oriented and was so sort of controlling in a way, not Andrew, but I think Mambochet was, because he admitted it. He felt that if women would be confused about how to accessorize, well, he would just remove all of that confusion and he would apply embellishment to the ensembles themselves. So what you see here, as far as the cowl and the cuffs, is embellishment embroidered directly onto the garment. So it basically eliminated any questions that a woman might have, but it also ensured that Mambochet's work would always be worn the way that he had envisioned it. And here are a few other examples where you can see that here there's a trompe-l'oeil necklace, or in the case of the strapless gown, he has created velvet jewelry to accompany it. Now, I don't think that Andrew is that controlling, but I do think that Andrew is a perfectionist. And in an effort to sort of reinforce how might a person accessorize these beautiful patterns, these electric color combinations, he created a number of bibs and or embellishments that work in a similar fashion. And so it really does create a complete look, or a total look, which is also something that the Americans embraced in their embrace and proliferation of American sportswear. And then I couldn't help but also offer this comparison of a 1945 dress from Mambochet on the right-hand side and that of one of Andrew's latest collections on the left-hand side, which of course is beautifully installed in this section here with the silhouetted butterflies. And I mentioned Halston because, Halston's silhouettes and his ethos was really drawn from the fact that he wanted as much simplicity in his clothing as possible. That doesn't mean boring. What it means is that he was a master of draping. He would create ensembles with yards and yards and yards of beautiful custom-made fabric, and he would use one hook and eye closure to keep the entire thing together. With Andrew, he employs one zipper. You step in, you zip up, and you walk away. And there's a kind of sort of comfort, I think, in that, where you're not sort of, bundled together and sort of cinched in with all of this corsetry, and it's uncomfortable, and things are poking you, and you have to, not breathe. But rather, you can still feel elegant. You can still feel sophisticated and be presented as such, but do so with that ease and simplicity. And then I also thought that this was an interesting comparison of a work from Halston on the right-hand side, using custom embroidery done by a family in New York, the Kahn family, and the piece on the left-hand side, which was worn by Jennifer Lopez, in the way in which both the embellishments are attached to the fabric, but also kind of that all-over patterning. Jackie mentioned that, I had the opportunity at the Chicago History Museum, and the Monboucher pieces and the Halston pieces are from the Chicago History Museum's collection, to be one of the first institutions to acquire Andrew's work. That really came through that engagement through the Chicago History Museum's the Costume Council's luncheon. Andrew wanted to donate things to the museum, and we gladly accepted it. When I came to the Peabody Essex Museum, which is a museum different from the Chicago History Museum and is much more like the Asian Civilization Museum, it is a museum that is founded on the notion of global trade. It is looking at cross-cultural hybridity. It is looking at Asian export art. We didn't have any Andrew in our collection yet, but we did have a donor who had a few works in her collection. And when she knew of my interest and understood that this exhibition was happening, she readily gave those pieces to us. In an effort to get Andrew's name and to connect people in our community with him, we also invited him in April of this year to join us in an event. We did a private event at our collection center, we were able to showcase 8 of his ensembles. And then we went into Boston for the evening and showcased 4 ensembles, which you see here on the screen. Andrew and I engaged in conversation, and he was able to be introduced to an entirely new market. And here are a few photos from that event. And then I mentioned the works that are now in PEM's collection. The first that you see here is this green evening gown. And this is from one of Andrew's heritage collections. I spoke briefly about sustainability as being another construct that Andrew has been thinking about. He's not interested in following trends. He's interested in creating clothing that will last and for people to invest in that clothing, which is a similar practice that Monboucher also adopted. He wasn't interested in following trends. Both feel that if you invest in one of their gowns, it truly should be timeless. And I understand that that's a word that people sort of throw around and can sometimes be overused. But in this case, it actually does apply. And so this work here is part of the Heritage Collection. And you can see a comparable image on the right-hand side, right-hand side, and also one in the exhibition. And then this is the other work that PEM acquired from the collection inspired or called Global Tribes. And this work in part was inspired by Gustav Klimt, The Tree of Life, which is in the Museum of Applied Art and Design in Vienna and was created in 1909. And you can see a more sort of obvious version on the left-hand side, which is included in the exhibition. And then the two works that were included in the Chicago History Museum's collection is this the coat on the left-hand side, which you then see on the right-hand side in the exhibition, which was inspired by the Wiener Werkstätte, but also Andrew said that when he had visited Chicago earlier in his career, he was really taken with the architecture of Chicago and sort of spoke to the clean lines and sort of the more geometric approach as being inspired by that. And then one of the other pieces that he donated to the museum in total was a collection that was inspired in part by Helena Rubinstein. And you can see the work here on the right-hand side on the runway and on the left-hand side in the exhibition. And as he says, Helena Rubinstein was a perfect combination of an aesthete and a businesswoman. She was a real woman, and a mix of the classic and the contemporary. And I thought that was a really lovely and touching collection for him to give to the Chicago History Museum, because the women who embraced him in that event and that luncheon are, for the most part, businesswomen. They are entrepreneurs in their own right. They are women who are establishing themselves and looking for clothes and aesthetics to empower them. And so to sort of summarize, Andrew says, London taught me to dream. He went to school in London, Milan. He continued his education in Milan, taught me about the industry. And New York taught me how to turn fashion into a business. And I think that that's something that we can really see in his work and his connections to the American market. And in my opinion, Andrew charted a unique path, and it is one that is established, and it is well respected, and it is sought after. And it is a brand that was that has built virtual bridges across oceans, and it is fusing the American sensibility with French fashion traditions. And so, of course, there's no mistaking that Andrew Ginn is a Parisian designer. He specifically established his brand in the fashion capital of the world so he could access the kind of talent and technology and craftsmanship that is required to make the beautiful and opulent works that have become his hallmarks. But Andrew is also a citizen of the world. And with his mixed Chinese and Japanese heritage, his Singaporean upbringing, his English education, and his American business sense, he really sort of summarizes what it means to be a global fashion designer. And so with that, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you for your time and your attention. And thank you again to Jackie. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have for me, and also, of course, for Jackie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Petra. You ended perfectly at 7:50, as we have discussed. And I think you have definitely brought up many important ideas about Andrew that were not covered in the exhibition. There's still so much more, so many layers, I think, to Andrew that could be brought up. And I think I've already seen some hands going up. I would perhaps take some questions for Petra.
Thank you very much. Yeah, great. Well, I noticed that his fashion right away was for women, and it seemed to be more the evening gowns. Like, how early in a career does a fashion designer decide, it'll be for women and at this particular style? It seemed pretty early, right on, what he intended.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if you know, but I think Andrew's always really designed for women. I think he's sort of played with the idea of designing for men. I think he's designed some custom pieces for himself and maybe friends. But as far as I know, and as far as I understand, he's always decided to design for women. And I think in part because he loves women. I think he loves to be with women. I think he appreciates and respects them. And I think a lot of that really stems from the relationship that he had with his mother and with his grandmother and the maternal, the women in his family.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think there has been quite a number of, men asking him for a menswear line. Yeah, just in recent months, he mentioned that he might launch a line soon. But I think as far as our research, and of course, as Andrew has said also, I think right now it's still just women's wear. Yeah. He is, of course, most, he has really kept to, as I mentioned, since 1995, he has shown up for every season for Paris Fashion Week. So before COVID, actually, he was doing 4 collections a year. So that's really quite a short turnaround time. But after COVID, he did mention that he rethought like the whole model or the need to have 4 collections a year. So now he actually has 2. Mm-hmm. And from my research, looking at what he has done through the years, I think from a very, very early on, in his practice, he already, in every collection, he always has some evening wear as well as day wear. Mm-hmm. But a long time as his works, his evening wear became more and more popular, he does now have a separate custom couture, bespoke service available, so that that people could go to get one-off pieces. But in this, when I was curating this exhibition, I wanted to be, it's actually a curator's dream, as Petra, you would agree, when Andrew said he kept his archive, he did keep a lot, so we have to be very selective in the stories we tell our audience. So I chose not to spotlight too many of the bespoke single pieces, because I thought it would be interesting to see what real women were wearing, from the ready to wear, rather than the custom pieces. But a lot of his custom pieces are for the American market. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry I hope the answer's not too long, but that's an interesting question. So could we take another question? perhaps from the students here, I saw some people scribbling a lot of notes. This is your chance to ask Petra in person.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating to see. I think what struck me the most was seeing the parallels to Halston, actually. And I was curious to hear from you, Petra, about your observations about maybe just the influence of the American market on the way he's run his business, because you mentioned that he's made the very distinct decision to stay independent. And I don't know if this is public information or like whether he has ever been approached by a luxury conglomerate to be acquired. Yeah, so I was just curious, like, how maybe being in the American market has shaped the way he's developed his brand. Yeah.
That's a great question. I don't know if he's ever been approached. I would be surprised if he had not been approached because it's a successful brand. But I have to imagine, and this is my opinion, but reading everything that happens in the fashion world with all of the major houses and sort of the buying and the selling and the trading and the placement of individuals. And Halston's a perfect example, actually, so I'll step back because that's a safer example. Halston was brilliant. And he grew at such a fast and rapid pace. And he was looking to expand, and he was approached by a corporation, and they made promises to him and said, we want to support you, we want to enable you to go bigger, bolder, greater. And, he signed a contract that was sort of ironclad, and when there were disagreements, when he felt that the quality was slipping or his designs weren't being honored in the way that they should be, and he tried to fight back, they said, I'm sorry, but the bottom line is the most important thing. And so he really struggled as a designer, and eventually he lost the right to use his own name. And, I think from a fashion history perspective, that has remained sort of a classic example of how to be sure that you are going slow and steady, and how to be sure that you also protect your designs and your name. This is an odd example, but I'm going to use this as well. If you know the story of Tina Turner and her, trials and tribulations, when she walked away from her partnership with her husband and her band, and all of the success that they had built together, the only thing that she wanted was her name, because she knew how important that was, and she knew that she could rebuild again with that name. And so, speculating without really knowing, I think that, it's important for the House of Andrew Ginn to remain independent so he can make those shifts from 4 collections a year to 2 collections a year. So he can make that shift from brick and mortar to e-commerce. And he's doing it because it suits him and his clients. And so they're not beholden to an outside source, sort of ignorant or maybe hyper-focused on the things that they shouldn't be focused on.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think perhaps some of you might be aware that in 1997, Andrew made global fashion history when he was appointed. He was the first Asian to be appointed the creative director of Pierre Balmain, which was of course one of the leading French houses. And he of course then working there, he recalls that experience because of course being in a way when you work for a house, of course it's bringing out the aesthetics of the house. And and he left after a season because there were many reasons, but one of the 2 things I remember he always said, and in my research in articles that he talked about later, is 2 things. One, he realized from that period that he wanted to have his own creative vision to be able to do what he wanted, and secondly was, I think that moving away from that collaboration actually allowed him to, he said, had a good starting fund for for him to create his label today, which he talked always about how the first 4 years was the early years was very difficult for him when he created his label in 1995. So this was 1997 when he was with Bauman. And then in 1999 was his breakthrough moment when the very famous, of course, multi-label store Colette did one window of his works, and that's when he said a lot of the luxury retailers, particularly from the US, like called him and still stock him today, that he's very grateful for. So I have asked, I didn't get a clear answer whether someone specifically mentioned, approach him, but I do get a sense like that from that early on experience in the 90s, he always thought that it's just much better to be able to do like what you want. And he said, and from my research going to spending 1 week with him and his team in Paris, I realized he surrounds himself with people that he, creatives that he have worked with and trained for, many of them for more than 10 years, because he said he always preferred to keep his team small and lean, and many of them already know the way he designs and works, so that he likes to, well, to me, in my perspective, as I did write in the publication, I think sometimes the way he works and the way he thinks remind me of the way reminds me of Singapore in general. It's small, it's lean, it's efficient. He's always talking about efficiency to his team, and his team would tell me his team is made up of many Europeans. The main thing is they must all speak French, and he says that obsession with efficiency and having a creative, independent creative vision is something that defines him too. So I hope that expanded on the question a little.
So I just thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. So, quick question. So I noticed his work is mostly, evening gowns or dresses. Just from the business point of view, if shoes or handbags, if you combine everything of that, do you aware his take on it? Is he planning on doing all that, or what's his takes on that?
Yes, no, that's an excellent question. And I learned through Jackie and the exhibition, actually, I didn't know this, that they do design all of their shoes for the runway presentations, but they don't sell them. And they also design all of the accessories, so the beautiful, large, emboldened earrings, which I would love to have. I don't think he's selling those either, but maybe we can petition and make a petition for him to do that. But no, as far as I know, it's always been very straightforward and clothing exclusively.
I think his main focus is definitely clothing. He does now sell his earrings and some of his bags, but talking to him, I feel that his focus is really the clothes, and he just want to make sure, as he says, like the model for the runway has reflects his total vision of how the dress should be. So he will always design the accessories, the bags, and the shoes, but he doesn't sell the shoes. From my research, he did try to sell one season, I think 1 year. And then I asked him why he stopped. Because I said, I read from the newspapers that you had a line, and he said, oh, Jackie, it's very hard to sell shoes. He said the way that the sizing and everything. So after, I think, 1 or 2 seasons, he cut back. The bags were launched later. He still has bags, but it's not the main. And actually, I do regret not having more in this exhibition. I ran out of time a little. There were various things I was working on, but we are working perhaps to take more of his bags as an incoming donation after this exhibition. But for this show, I think we have 2 bags on display, because I think I needed a bit more time to research on these bags to get some of them. But in this show, you already see the accessories. They are all like matched by Andrew himself, because he has to have this total like look of how the mannequin should be. So everything you see is styled by him. Yeah.
But it's an excellent question, because if you think about how many fashion houses, their bread and butter, if you will, is really sunglasses, handbags, all of the licensing that they do. And Andrew hasn't done that, which I think is another way of sort of, as Jackie implies, lean, efficient, streamlined, and focused. Yeah.
If we have, because part of that too, for dresses that are made for celebrities, after they wear it that evening, then what happens? Like, are people able to buy that particular dress, say that Jennifer Lopez wore, or does it go to a museum?
So that's a very interesting question. So basically, have I turned it on? Can you hear?
Oh,
Can hear? Okay. Yeah. So for the pieces on display, I clarified with Andrew. So actually, everything that you see on display are from his archive. So they are samples or prototypes. So meaning they are the piece, because most, as I mentioned, I took most of the pieces, almost everything I selected are the ready-to-wear line. And so these are the samples of the prototype that once he approved, then he would ask certain manufacturers to make them in limited numbers. But the very one you see in the museum is the first prototype. And so the celebrities, they are not made for the celebrities. They come, their stylists come to him, or they come to him and say they would like to maybe borrow that look. And after they are done with their event, they are then returned to his archive. So I do have there's one piece on display that was worn by Lily Collins in Emily in Paris. It came the way exactly she wore it in the show, which is the collar is stitched down. So as part of good curatorial practice, I have to tell the living fashion designer, I told Andrew, like, okay, can we display it this way so that people look at the photo and then this is exactly how she wear it, and people would know she wore it, right? And that's to a museum very important, the history of the piece. And Andrew says, but I prefer the way I style it on the runway. So I have to ask the conservator to unstitch the collar that was stitched down. And there was another dress that came in. It was the one worn by Zoe Tay, which is a local actress. She's not as tall, so it was actually folded in. And Andrew said, but I want to see my full flowers. So again, we had to. So those really are worn by them. So that is the ones for the celebrities. But to answer that question as well, we have the design that's worn by Catherine, Princess of Wales, on display. That's actually not worn by her. That's just the design, the prototype with Andrew, because for royalty, they're considered private clients. So they're supposed to buy the work. So they are just like me and you, we should support. Like fashion designers, this is part of their bread and butter. So that piece is not. So I'm very specific in the text. For that, I say she wore the design. But the rest, I would say, like those looks are worn by them. But you can imagine the celebrities, usually they don't wear it again. So to them, it's borrowing one time for publicity, and then it goes back to Andrew. But Andrew is very selective. He and his team have told me they have limited time they get so many requests to wear their work, but it's a whole process whereby the stylist would say, so and so is going for this event, would you want to support? And you could send your work, but at the end of the day, they might still not wear it because they get a few and they choose on the spot. So it takes time. And so Andrew also said, like, for a small label like his, he wants to focus on the A-listers. So in that part of the show, I also just wanted to show that kind of emphasis and effort his team put into it. Thank you.
I have to say, Jackie, it's funny just listening to you describe that situation. Well, absolutely. But also, I mean, if we are going to equate fashion with art, which I do on my daily basis, and in the museum setting, you bring up an excellent point from a curatorial perspective, and I would feel the same way, presented as it was worn. But let's say a Warhol and someone framed it halfway through. Half of his piece was covered, he would probably be very upset, because as an artist, he would say, no, I want you to see the full piece. Don't just show half of it or a quarter of it. So it's an interesting, different way of thinking about it.
I almost thought of not asking him. Then I decided, okay, better not. I should respect him. Yeah. I think we are 10 minutes past 8. I just want to thank everybody again for turning up to join us this evening for our last talk. We're really glad for everybody in this room, or everybody who comes to see our exhibitions on fashion, because it's still a new area of development, contemporary fashion for ACM. We actually still do get comments about why is an Asian art museum collecting or presenting contemporary fashion, which of course we don't get this kind of questions for, say, the Met and the V&A in the West. So we're definitely still trying to build up, in a way, popular support here in Singapore, and I think in Asia, for contemporary fashion exhibitions. So I'll be really, really grateful if you scan the QR code and give us some feedback that for whatever parts of tonight or the exhibition that you have really enjoyed. We are really compiling the survey and really putting up to the ministry to show that there are new people coming. We do, for example, we see a lot of young people, which we are very, very grateful for, because the average person coming to the museum is above 40 years old. So for this exhibition, 40% are in their 20s based on our surveys. So, but of course, everybody in this room matter. Please try to scan and give us some feedback. Yeah, and we're so glad again tonight for Petra. She flew like halfway around the world from Salem near Boston, and we're really, really glad to have her here in person. If you really like to see the full essay, get the catalog tomorrow. I hear they're stocking it again. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Jackie.